Why, that area was ruled by her family, and Jinchi had just sworn fealty to her. I do not know for sure yet, but I have an idea, Jinchi said half to himself. Sir Gyukuo's daughter will soon enter the rear palace. Oh, Maomao nodded, but she was also puzzled. Entering the rear palace meant the girl would become the emperor's bride. His Majesty would be hard-pressed to turn down the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the Western capital. One of his relatives is already the empress. She is His Majesty's proper wife, Maomao thought. Was Gyukuo attempting to strengthen his family's influence by bringing another relative into the court? I wonder what Master Gyukuan thinks of this, Maomao said. But doesn't it place Empress Gyukuo in a somewhat difficult position? The daughter of her older brother would be the empress's niece. Political marriages often involved partners with close blood ties, but Gyukuo wasn't pleased at the prospect. What about Gyukuan? With his daughter's position already secured, would he really want a grandchild to join the court as well? That is, if she is really a blood relation. Maomao thought she was seeing cracks in the facade of Gyukuo's family. Is the empress opposed to her niece's admission to the palace? She asked. Jinchi didn't reply immediately, which Maomao took to mean she had the right idea. His expression told the story. Finally he said, it is true she is not eager. However, she cannot chase the girl out of the rear palace either. This means there must be a compromise. There were very few princes in the current imperial line. There were only 3 of them in fact, and 2 were infants. There was just one serious candidate. Congratulations on your marriage, Master Jinchi, Maomao said, clapping her hands. Without a word, Jinchi grabbed her by the head and squeezed. She yelped in surprise. When he released her, she rubbed the side of her head and reminded herself that sometimes it was better to keep her mouth shut. You think I am getting married with this body? It is the body you gave yourself, Maomao objected privately, but this time she was clever enough to keep it to herself. She asked, just as a reference, is there anyone else who could marry her? You would have to look back several generations in the imperial family. These are people who spend most of their time cooped up in temples. They read holy texts and keep their distance from the common world. I do not see any candidates there, assuming none of them have begun to nurture ambitions large enough to start a rebellion. And do you suppose she and her father would not be satisfied with a capable retainer? However, if Jinchi were to depart for the western capital at the same time the young lady arrives, the wedding could be postponed for months. The father of the bride could not even object, because he was the one who had summoned Jinchi. I feel bad for the girl, dragging herself all the way here just to sit around and wait. Sympathetic though she might be, there was nothing Maomao could do. However, if Jinchi had been willing to marry a girl simply to make her happy, many young ladies with sad stories would have appeared at his door. One cannot be overly concerned with other people's affairs. Maomao had other things to do. When do you think you'll be leaving? She asked. 2 months from now, he replied. Not much time remained. She had so much to learn and she would have to do it in a hurry. Jinchi looked like he wanted to say something else, so she asked, is there anything else on your mind, sir? He paused, then said, I do not have enough information yet. I will get in touch with you another time. Very well, sir. Maomao gathered up her medicines and bandages. She confirmed when she should come back next and then left the villa. Chapter 7 Taboo. The next day, the library at the freak strategist's house had been conscientiously cleaned up. The carpet was back in place and the bookshelves were where they belonged. If anything was different, it was only that the faded carpet had been replaced with a new one. Master Lahan told one of the servants to clean things up, NN reported. Is that right? Maomao said with relief. She left immediately after the events of the previous day. She felt bad leaving Yao and NN to untangle the room. I did indeed, someone said. And the least you could do is be grateful, little sister. She did not wish to be grateful to this person at all. He was sitting in a chair at the moment. What the hell are you even doing here? Maomao asked. What a way to talk, he replied. With my honored father away, I am in charge of this household. In other words, Maomao said, you have plenty of time on your hands. Is my father coming or not? NN said. Maomao, watch your tone. Yao was already seated and waiting eagerly. Liuhemen arrived, announced by the tapping of his cane on the floor. He thanked the servant who was aiding him as he entered the library. NN closed the door. The windows were shut. Candles had been set out for light and filled the room with illumination and a sweet smell of honey. I am not too keen on using fire in a library. Maomao would make sure to put the candles out and change the air in the room the moment this conversation was over. She pulled out a chair for Liumen. "Thank you," he said. He looked troubled, likely because of the book sitting on the table. "Granduncle, you don't mind if I'm here?" Lahan asked. "You might wish to reconsider where you stick your neck," Lahan said. "Liumen, I take your point. I would like to be aware of what is going on in my house. I do not typically avoid responsibility by saying I did not know." In some ways, Lahan had a personality quite different from Maomao's. Perhaps he was simply confident he could handle any problems resulting from his actions. Are we correct? "Is this Carda's book?" Yao asked, rising and propping up the sheepskin tome. "Yes," Liumen said. "I compiled it while I was studying in the West." Yao's face tightened. Nen remained impassive and Lahan looked downright intrigued. "Did you also make these illustrations then, Master Liumen?" Yao asked. She flipped the pages, showing the depictions of open human bodies. "I did," she said. "I drew those illustrations and I did the dissections as well." At the word dissections, Yao's face got even stiffer. Human dissection was not many people's idea of a good time. Defiling a dead body was considered immoral and was forbidden. Were they criminals? Yao asked. Liumen shook his head sadly. He stood up and turned to the last page of the book. There was a picture of a woman there. She appeared to be a foreigner. Her hair billowed and her light skin tone was depicted in delicate brushstrokes. Her internal organs were drawn in a realistic fashion. However, her face bore the stylized, serene expression of a bodhisattva. There were ink stains here and there. This page was noticeably less clean than the others. The land to the west knows much that we do not. There is a great deal we can learn from them, but it does not mean that everything they do is right. I often saw them mete out punishment to people who had committed no crime. There was grief in Liumen's eyes. He seemed to be gazing into the past. This woman was said to be a witch. To test whether the accusation was true, they tied her to a boulder and threw her in the water, where she sank. Maomao shivered. Liumen did not speak much of the time he had spent studying beyond Li's borders. He mostly shared stories of injuries and illnesses he had seen. He explained that if she did not float to the surface, it would prove she was not a witch. But if she did float, it would show she was a witch, and they would burn her alive. They decided the woman was not a witch, but it did not restore her breath. Yao was pale and her hands shook. She seemed to be deciding whether to cover her ears. She felt she had to listen but did not want to hear. Nen asked the question that everyone was thinking. "These witches, are they criminals?" No, they might have followed a different faith. They were sometimes called heretics. They were also students of medicine. Sometimes wandering commoners were treated as witches too. In that sense, perhaps I was one of them. Liumen closed the book. His fingers brushed the word witchcraft on the cover. She understood why people would accuse her of being a witch. She was the one who taught me the ways of Western medicine. She asked me herself to use her body for dissection when she died. She would offer up her own body for the advancement of medicine. There was a slight tremor in Liumen's voice. Because of her, I was able to save the Empress Dowager and her child. The Empress Dowager had become pregnant when she was very young. She hadn't been able to deliver her child naturally, so they had to cut her belly open. Yao struck the table with a hand that was still trembling. "Then you abandoned your own teacher, Master Liumen. That is horrible." There was a charge in the air. Liumen did not deny it. Nen stayed silent as well. No, Maomao began, but she was interrupted by Lahan. "I believe my granduncle did the right thing," he said. "Let's consider the factors. If the woman fled, it would mean she was a witch. If she was rescued, that would also show she was a witch. And the one who rescued her was just an itinerant scholar who came to their land to learn. She is witch material, no question. Even if this was before granduncle was castrated, what could he have done all by himself? You seem to be imagining something from a picture book. It is like one man against the world, riding in to rescue the captured princess and defeat the evildoers. Then they all live happily ever after. Is that what you have in mind? That is not what would have happened. The only difference would have been 2 corpses instead of 1. But Yao understood intellectually, but emotionally it was hard to process. Maomao reached for the book, trying to open to the last page again. Liu Humen kept his hand on the cover, holding it shut. "That's right," he said. "I was powerless. My teacher would do anything to save people. She would dress as a man to attend convocations of doctors and participate in the dissection of criminals. She was able to help some people, but there were other lives she couldn't save. She always asked what more she could do, and she did not begrudge any answer. The day before her arrest as a witch, she was summoned as a physician. She traveled to the next town to help an injured child. Someone there claimed her methods were unnatural. Her accuser was a woman who was also suspected of being a witch. She offered my teacher as a sacrifice to prove her own innocence. The story might have seemed like a small detour, but Maomao understood what Liu Humen was trying to explain. There were two things to consider. First, dissection might be considered unwelcome, but it was a way to save lives. Second, heresy would be persecuted. Carter's book, the one my father speaks of, is heretical, but it is not evil. People insist on equating the two, however. When he told them to take up Carter's book, he meant that they had to accept the deviant practices within it. He also meant they must accept that they themselves would step outside the accepted ways of their society. Women had little status in Li. They could not become doctors, and if they somehow got involved with a dissection, there was no telling how they might be treated. Liu Humen was worried not only for Maomao's future, but also for Yao's and Enen's. Enen's expression was hard to read. She had said she would abide by Yao's choice, but Liu Humen's story appeared to shake her deeply. Yao was equally troubled. As for Maomao, she already knew what she had to do. "Right, granduncle, a question," Lahan said, thrusting his hand in the air hard enough to cut the tension in the room. Maomao wished she could chase those spectacles and that tousled hair away. "Was this autopsy the reason you returned from your travels?" "Yes, it was. I dug up her grave and dissected her. When I attempted to return her to her resting place, I was discovered and nearly killed. If a fellow student hadn't helped me, I would probably be at the bottom of a river now. My friend stole a horse and saw me safely to the estate of a merchant with ties to Li. That is how I survived. It turned out Liu Humen could be quite brave sometimes. This friend of yours." "Is that Dr. Liu?" Enen asked. "I must say I have caused Dr. Liu quite a lot of trouble over the years." Dr. Liu, Maomao could picture the physician's careworn face. She had always known he was hard on her because she was related to Liu Humen, and this understanding was now reinforced. "Another question, if I may," Enen said. "If I am not mistaken, Li's laws only permit the dissection of executed criminals. You make it sound like Dr. Liu has experience with dissections himself." She sounded as though she was choosing her words carefully. To Maomao, it seemed she was already mostly sure about this, but she wanted to ask just the same. "I can say nothing of what is to come after this. But let me ask a question. If you are skilled at needlework, does that mean you can sew human skin the first time you are called upon to do so? Could you cut human flesh as readily as you slice into a fish in the kitchen? The answer, of course, is no." Enen perhaps found the questions foolish, and she went quiet. There was a long moment in which none of them spoke. Lahan broke the silence. "Perhaps a doctor ought to do at least a little dissection, We know for a fact that my granduncle's experience in such things enabled him to save the Empress Dowager and her child. It is unlikely to be the last time a member of the imperial family finds themselves in dire straits, whether ill or injured." Maomao wanted to yell at him to be quiet, but she had a question she wanted to ask, so she remained silent. An injured member of the royal family. It reminded her of something she very much wished not to remember. Liu Humen looked troubled again. He said, "I think this requires another story." Maomao well knew that stories sometimes took detours. Long, long ago there was a physician named Carter. He was not the Carter of legend, but a real doctor of unparalleled skill. His name came from both his gift for medicine and a distant connection to the imperial bloodline. Was this one of the things that had inspired Liu Humen to call this text Carter's book? Enen asked what happened to him. It is said he did many dissections in the interests of medicine. He was not afraid to use his authority as a member of the imperial family, even if it was only marginal, to further his work. He did not limit his collecting to criminals. He also collected the corpses of people who had died of unusual illnesses. He trusted in his abilities and his conviction that what he was doing was right. Liu Hemen continued. He made one miscalculation. Among the bodies he gathered was that of a young prince. The prince was the son of the reigning monarch and the apple of his father's eye. The prince had died young from a mysterious illness. Most of the people around the table quickly understood the implications of what they were told. Only Yao looked like she was having trouble keeping up. The remains of members of the imperial family were supposed to stay in the mausoleum for a year after their death. It was very clear the emperor would be furious to discover that Kada had not only taken the body from its resting place, but had also dissected it. Kada was expelled from the royal family and executed. His real name was not left to posterity, and even the physician of legend was called Genka from that time forward. All the scrolls and every note Kada had made were burned. Doctors were forbidden from practicing dissection. Considering the emperor's state of mind at the time, I doubt anyone dared to object. In those days it was forbidden even to speak the name Kada. Thus this man was wiped out of history, except among physicians themselves. They continue to talk of him and tell each other his story. His actions saved many patients. He was not a god and not immortal, just a human like you or me. Liu Hemen Maomao saw was praising the great deeds of this nameless doctor. At the same time, Liu Hemen was also criticizing his arrogance. Did that cause medical methods to become dramatically more crude? She asked, being careful to take a polite tone so NN wouldn't get upset. Very much so. Otherwise we might have saved the former emperor's honored siblings. People whisper that the former Empress Dowager had them assassinated, but we have written records indicating that in fact it was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis. Maomao was surprised. She had heard that the brothers had died of a spreading sickness. Tuberculosis was notably deadly, yes, but for it to have killed all of the former emperor's brothers meant treatment must have been abominably delayed. Either they failed to isolate the first patient, or they mistakenly thought it was just a cold. She had always assumed it was a matter of bloodline that prevented the former emperor from catching the illness. Perhaps it was because he had spent so much of his time apart from the other princes. She had heard that his mother, the one often called the Empress Regnant, had been one of the lower consorts. She said, when study is neglected, there is no limit to how low a discipline can sink. I went to study in the West because the former Empress Dowager was alarmed by the paucity of medical knowledge we possessed. I am sure she hoped her own son wouldn't succumb to some illness. Much as she liked to make revolutionary changes, Kada still made it impossible for her to openly reverse the ban on dissections. I suppose she understood how a parent felt when their child had been so deeply disrespected. She could not openly change the laws. This was the key point. Behind closed doors and in secret, doctors were conducting autopsies even now to advance medicine. Perhaps we could conclude this conversation here. Liu Hemen looked at each of them as if it were a genuine question. Yao did not answer. Yes, sir, said NN, still bothered but drained. Very well, Maomao said more firmly. There were still so many things she wanted to know, but Liu Hemen looked like he was finished answering questions. So that is the story, said Lahan. He had begun this conversation as a third wheel and ended it sounding no more involved. If you do not make this decision, then I urge you to forget everything you heard here today. You'll be happiest that way, said Liu Hemen. He was still conscientious enough to leave them a way out. He trusted that Yao NN and even Lahan would keep the secret to themselves. I'll be going back then. Is there a carriage, Lahan? I'll have one made ready immediately. Liu Hemen tucked the book gingerly among the folds of his robes. This cannot stay here any longer, he said. He began to leave the library, his cane tapping on the ground. Maomao took a handkerchief from her own robes and handed it to him. You cannot leave a book that valuable just sitting out there. Someone will steal it, she said, quietly enough that NN wouldn't hear. True, thank you, I will be careful. She watched him go. The tapping of his cane was the only sound. She could have excused herself to see him safely to his carriage, but Lahan went with him. Therefore Maomao elected to stay. She was more concerned about the other two people in the library at that moment. I am hungry, she thought. The sun was high in the sky by now, but NN showed no sign of preparing a meal, so Maomao resigned herself to doing some cooking. All right, food is ready, Maomao said. They had been making buns in the main kitchen. She convinced them to share some ingredients with her. She added a meat filling to turn the buns into proper dumplings, and she hadn't done a bad job of it if she said so herself. She could have stopped there, but there were some other interesting ingredients nearby, so she decided to make one more dish as well. Now she stood before the other two women. Neither of them seemed to have much appetite. She was holding the dumplings and something they had never seen before. Yao reacted first. What's that? Perhaps we could call it Basi Hongshu silk reeling sweet potatoes, Maomao replied. In other words, these were sweet potatoes with a starchy sauce over them. She had diced the sweet potatoes, peels and all. Then she fried them in oil and covered them in starch syrup. There seemed to be a lot of sweet potatoes in this household.